Good evening. There's a happy buzz in this room as old friends reconnect, and so it's just a real delight to welcome all of you to the 2019 Bram Fischer Lecture. My name's Elizabeth Quiche. I am the warden of Rhodes House. And this is the 12th memorial lecture that we've hosted, and we're delighted this year to welcome an outstanding speaker, Professor Stephen Clingman, who I will be introducing in just a few moments. We're also delighted to have members of the Clingman family, as well as members of the Fischer family, friends of Bram Fischer, Lady Joffe, Yvonne Malan. We're so honored to have all of you here with us. I wanted to give all of you just a little bit more background on Bram Fischer himself and on this lecture and how it came about. The Rhodes Trust is a global scholarship organization, actually the oldest international graduate scholarship in the world, that brings together and develops exceptional people from all over the world in all fields of study who are impatient with the way things are, who want to make the world a better place, who want to learn together, to be in community with those from around the world, and to build communities of learning and change. So Bram Fischer was a Rhodes Scholar elected from Orange Free State and New College in 1931, and is one of many scholars across our 116-year history who went on to shape the future of her or his country. He was a South African lawyer of Afrikaner descent and became a notable anti-apartheid activist, most notably leading the defense team for Nelson Mandela at the Rivonia trial. We're very proud to have him as part of our legacy. Nelson Mandela said, Bram Fischer challenged his own people because he felt that what they were doing was morally wrong. As an Afrikaner, his conscience forced him to be ostracized by his own people, and he showed a level of courage and sacrifice that was immeasurable. I fought only against injustice, not against my own people, unquote. Braum was sentenced to life imprisonment on the 9th of May, 1966, and sadly remained a prisoner until his death on the 8th of May, 1975, at the age of 67. Nelson Mandela, still in prison on Robben Island, refused permission to attend the funeral, but was to write subsequently, the dictators of oppression and brutality had other unintended effects, and that is what produced the Bram Fischers of our time, men of such extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity that their kind may never be known again. Reflecting on Bram Fischer's life brings to mind the beautiful South African philosophical concept, Ubuntu, humanity, I am because you are. Justice Langa, former Chief Justice of the South African Constitutional Court, spoke about Ubuntu as a culture which places emphasis on the interdependence of the members of a community. It recognizes a person's status as a human being entitled to constitutional and unconditional respect, dignity, value, and acceptance from the members of the community that such person happens to be a part of. But it entails the converse as well, he went on to say. The person has a corresponding duty to give the same respect, dignity, value, and acceptance to each member of their community. More importantly, it regulates the exercise of rights by the emphasis it lays on sharing and co-responsibility and on the creation of the conditions for the mutual enjoyment of rights by all. Bram Fischer dedicated his life to helping to create those conditions, and he did so under extremely difficult and ultimately deadly circumstances. 2 years ago, we unveiled a portrait of Bram Fischer. It is in the center of Milner Hall there, which we are proud to display here in Milner Hall. And later this evening, we will unveil a memorial plaque in his honor at the request of his family, and we're very grateful that his family requested this. Bram Fischer has no official resting place, so we hope that this goes some way towards publicly honoring his legacy, and we are so grateful to all of you for being here and being part of that important recognition. The unveiling will take place after the lecture and the Q&A, and it will be done by Sean Johnson, himself a South African Rhodes Scholar, who recently completed 16 years of distinguished service as the founding CEO of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation and was himself a key player in the anti-apartheid struggle. Sean is spending this term in Oxford as a distinguished visitor at Harris Manchester College and here at Rhodes House, working on a history of the Mandela Rhodes Scholarship, which I'm sure will be a terrific book, and I greatly look forward to reading it and appreciate, Sean, your presence here. Today is historic also because it is the first time that the Bram Fischer Lecture is being live streamed. And so we are delighted to welcome our guests who are watching us live from Johannesburg. The event there is being hosted by Mr. Justice David Unterhalter, who practiced at the Johannesburg Bar from 1990 to 2017, specializing in trade law, commercial, and constitutional law. And we thank Justice Unterhalter and welcome everyone who is watching this lecture and this event through live stream. Over the years, we have welcomed a wide range of speakers, but a common thread is their commitment to justice and Africa. And we're delighted that this afternoon's lecture will be delivered by Professor Stephen Clingman. Professor Clingman was born in South Africa and educated in Johannesburg at the University of Witwatersrand and right here at the University of Oxford at Teddy Hall, where he completed his doctorate. He is Distinguished University Professor in the English Department at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He was previously chair of the English Department and founding director of the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute there, and he has held fellowships at Yale, Cornell, the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and many other places. His book, Bram Fischer, Afrikaner Revolutionary, was the first full-length Bram Fischer biography. It won the Alan Paton Award for Nonfiction and is widely recognized as the definitive biography of Bram Fischer. Interestingly, two earlier Bram Fischer speakers have also won the Alan Paton Award, so that is another thread of this event. Albie Sachs, who delivered the lecture in 2009, and Justice Edwin Cameron, whose portrait is also here in the hall, who spoke in 2015. And we're also delighted to have Professor Kate O'Regan, a former Bram Fischer lecturer and director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights, and a Rhodes trustee. Stephen's biography about Bram Fischer's life has been reprinted several times and in 2018 was released as an ebook. Last year marked the 20th anniversary of the biography's publication, so it is an especially fitting time for Stephen to speak about Bram's enduring influence and events since then. And he mentioned to me that of all the books he's written, this is the book that has had the greatest sort of resonance and life. After he completed the research for the book, he donated the bulk of the material to the Bodleian Library here in Oxford, and it forms an essential part of the Bram Fischer archive, which Lucy McCann, former librarian at Rhodes House, and Ivan Malan have been working on. The title for this year's lecture is Bram Fischer in Our Times. Certainly we are living in difficult and complex times with multiplying challenges, many of them rooted in historical patterns of injustice and intolerance reaching back over the decades, which Bram Fischer himself would have recognized all too easily. We're honored to have Bram Fischer's biographer reflect with us on these themes. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Clingman.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real thrill for me to be here, a great honor and a great pleasure to deliver this lecture, and not least to follow in the footsteps of other distinguished speakers, an extraordinary run of speakers who have gone before me. It's also very encouraging and very nice to see familiar faces, family, and friends. So before I start, some thanks are due. First of all, to the Warden of Rhodes House, Elizabeth Kish, and to Rhodes House for the invitation and for hosting me here, to Julie Knight, who put a huge amount of work into making this happen. And I would like to thank and to note particularly Yvonne Milan, who has done so much to keep the memory and legacy of Bram Fischer alive. My profound thanks go out to someone who, of course, is not here, Lord Joel Joffe, who sponsored my research on Bram Fischer and whose spirit presides over this lecture. It is also a tremendous pleasure to see Lady Vanetta Joffe here today. My thanks too to members of Bram Fischer's family, to Ruth and Ilse Fischer, and in retrospect to Bram's brothers, Drs. Paul and Gus Fischer, who gave so generously of their time and memories when I was doing the research for the biography. And I would like to remember others who supported and guided me in so many ways, among them Arthur Chaskelson and Lorraine Chaskelson, to whose memory I dedicate this lecture. And finally, my thanks go out to my family for their support, for their tolerance, which it took, I must tell you, for the length of time that I took on that biography, and also to my own institution, the University of Massachusetts, which has been so generous to me over the years. So just a word about this lecture. I thought that because it occurs in Oxford, because it occurs in this place, because that portrait is hanging here, because this plaque will be unveiled, that among the things I wanted to do was reflect on Bram Fischer's time in Oxford, because I think it was so important for him. So I'll get there. It's not where I'm going to start, but I will get there. So Bram Fischer in our times. Bram Fischer's era was characterized by particular features: the struggle against apartheid, the rise of Nazism and the Second World War, the Cold War that followed, the political trials Braun fought as an advocate, and which also involved him as an accused. On the surface, at least, the world we face is now quite different. Ours is an era of displacement, of refugees, of perpetual wars, of authoritarianism, populism, climate change. Our very modes of inquiry and even existence have changed with the surrounding environment of the internet. Most acutely, some of the things Braun believed in have crumbled, only to be resurrected in morbid forms. Some of the things he fought against have sadly endured, albeit in new shapes. We might think there is no connection between the two eras, certainly in relation to the life of Bram Fischer, and yet I want to argue the contrary. Drawing on particular moments and motifs in his life, I want to think about Bram Fischer's relevance now, in our times. What are the linkages between his era and ours? What does his life have to say to the era we now inhabit? That's what I want to explore today. And moreover, whereas we tend to think of Bram Fischer almost exclusively in a South African context, I also want to widen the frame to think of global issues, because Braun, concerned himself with those issues too. In exploring these matters, I'm going to be guided by three prevailing images that I connect with Bram Fischer's life. The first is an image of two hands. The second is of a pool of water, an image which resonates in two different guises. The third is the image of a doorway. Two hands, a pool of water, and a doorway. These provide my entry into Bram Fischer's story. The broad outlines of this story are well known, but may be worth rehearsing briefly here, and I'll be following in your footsteps a little there, Elizabeth. Braun was born on April the 23rd, 1908, a birthday I actually share with him, the 23rd part, not the 1908, into a very eminent Afrikaner family. His grandfather, Abraham Fischer, had been a leading figure in the Orange Free State in the lead-up to the Anglo-Boer War. After the war, he was the first and only Prime Minister of the Orange River Colony, and then later a member of the first cabinet of the Union of South Africa. Braum's father, Percy, was, like both Abraham and Braum, a lawyer, and became judge president of the Orange Free State. During the rebellion of 1914, Percy supported the rebels who opposed South Africa's entry into World War I on the side of Britain, and the family paid a price for that affiliation. Braum attended the University of Cape Town for a year and then moved to Grey University College in Bloemfontein, partly because it would be easier to get a Rhodes Scholarship from there. This was among the anomalies, the various anomalies in Braum's life, for Rhodes was, in his family, the arch-imperialist. I hope I can say that with the portrait behind me over there, with all due respect. And I think it sort of speaks to Braum's openness, his pragmatism, and possibly a certain degree of opportunism, that he was quite content to come. And he had a wonderful time here. He duly won the Rhodes and was in England from early 1932. And in England from 1932 to 1934, he traveled on the continent. He saw the rise of Nazism and met refugees from Nazi Germany. He also traveled in the Soviet Union, writing letters back to his family, both in English and Afrikaans, on his observations. Right through this time, Braum was also writing copious letters to Molly Krieger, the spirited and independent and sometimes self-doubting woman who later became his wife. After various tribulations, he and Molly were married in 1937, a few years after Braum's return to South Africa to take up practice as an advocate in Johannesburg. Braum became involved in liberal organizations and then gravitated leftwards, joining the Communist Party, as far as I could make out, sometime in the early 1940s. That was after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and thereafter Braum became deeply immersed in the politics of his time. His career followed parallel tracks. On the one hand, he was on a retainer from the capitalist gold mining houses in Johannesburg. On the other, he was a leading member of the Communist Party, yet a further anomaly. After the war, he became involved in key political trials of the era, most notably the treason trial of 1956 to 61, in which he was second in command in a team which fashioned the acquittal of all 156 accused, a triumph of quite remarkable juridical genius. And I read the records of that trial. It really was a work of great genius. Later, at great danger to himself, Braum led the defense of Nelson Mandela and the other accused in the Rivonia trial and won life sentences when death was a distinct possibility. By this stage, the Communist Party had been long banned, though it had reconstituted itself underground. Braum himself had been banned by the same Minister of Justice who appointed him King's Counsel. The anomalies continued. In that period of the 1960s, life contracted for Braum and Molly. First, Molly was detained in the emergency of 1960. Then, in a desperately tragic accident immediately following the Rivonia trial, she was drowned as she and Braum were driving to Cape Town to visit their daughter Ilse and also to see the prisoners on Robben Island. Braum himself was arrested, put on trial, then was given leave to fight a case at the Privy Council in London and subsequently returned to stand trial in South Africa, as he had promised to do. He then absconded from that trial, was struck off the roll of advocates, and went underground under the name of Douglas Black. He had become a distinguished lawyer pursued by the police, living on the margins in Johannesburg in disguise. I can no longer serve justice in the way I have attempted to do during the last 30 years, he wrote in the letter announcing his absence from his trial. I can only do so in the way I have now chosen. Ultimately, after some 10 months underground, Braum was captured and put on trial again and sentenced to life imprisonment. During that imprisonment, he was treated harshly, and when his son Paul died of cystic fibrosis, Braum and Molly, Paul had been cared for so intensely by Braum and Molly, Braum was not allowed to go to the funeral. When Braum contracted cancer in prison, he was finally allowed to go to his brother Paul's house for the last weeks of his life, though he was still considered a prisoner. When Braum died and was cremated, the authorities ordered that his ashes be returned to the prison's department. For all these reasons and more, Braum's story lives on. He was someone who dedicated himself completely to the cause of human liberation, and he did it through an extraordinary personality, one that combined modesty, politeness, steeliness, determination, and an unfailing sense of responsibility. He had an ability to win people over through a form of personal engagement that exemplified a way of being in the world. His story is a stirring one of great drama, stress, suffering, and transcendent heroism in which he offered the gifts and ultimately the supreme gift of his life. It is why we remember him today. Well, as I've suggested, we live now in very different times. The world as it stands in 2019 can appear utterly dizzying, with multiple challenges on every front, challenges to which I will return. But I want to begin to shape my argument that there are links between Bram Fischer's time and ours, links we can begin to see through the lens of his life. My thought is that despite some of the complexities and complications of that life, perhaps even because of those complexities and complications, we can take Bram Fischer as a model. Indeed, we need to take him as a model, a template of sorts. He allows us to see the challenges of our own times more clearly. Let me begin then with the first of my three images, two hands. One hand was black, the other white, a visual symmetry of opposition, if you like, and they met towards the end of the early 1920s in Bloemfontein in a handshake. Some of you will know what I'm referring to. The white hand belonged to Bram Fischer, and the black hand to a man he had just met at a meeting of the Joint Council of Europeans and Africans. The Joint Councils were forums where white and black men, the latter usually ministers or teachers, where these people would meet to discuss matters of common concern. And Braum had been brought onto the Bloemfontein Council by his former teacher and mentor, Leo Marquardt. At that point, Braum was still a nationalist, the legacy of his family and the history they had collectively lived through. He had been the first nationalist prime minister in the mock parliament of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, an organization Leo Marquardt had founded, and the position seemed a prophecy of his future, the eminence he would achieve. But at this meeting, something else occurred, just a handshake, that was all. Even to call one hand white and the other black is to miscategorize, because no hand is absolutely white, no hand absolutely black. Yet the opposition they suggest, especially in an encounter such as this, come from the constructions of race. And what Braum felt also came from those constructions. For the handshake was deeply and instantly troubling to him. He felt an inner revulsion, a sensation of the taboo of touch, a physical recoil suggesting some fear of contagion. Such are the psychological effects of racism, and they went to the heart of Braum's sense of being. Certainly he had come to this meeting with goodwill, he was committed to it, yet the physical and psychological space of encounter became a barrier, as if the magnetic poles that attract had quite suddenly reversed. Again, a number of you will know the outcome. Braum could have let that moment be one of total aversion. He could have abandoned the Joint Council, left Leo Marquardt to his own devices, retreated to the known world of his family and his social and cultural heritage, gone on to be that nationalist prime minister. Or a more seductive solution might have suggested itself, to keep going to the Joint Council meetings, even to continue to shake hands, and to pass this off through the habits of routine as a disturbing syndrome to which he could accommodate himself and which he would conceal. But that was not what Braum did. Instead, the moment became the occasion for profound introspection on his part. More than 30 years later, it was significant enough for him to recall in his speech from the dock. It was the handshake that made him contemplate the different or indifferent sense of self and other he had enjoyed as a child when he played with his black friends on the family farm at Bergendal. I can still sense the active will that it required from one who had grown up on the farm with little Lul and Golokwan as his only playmates, but who in the space of a few years had drifted completely into the normal South African attitude. Braum went on to tell the court, what became abundantly clear was that it was I who had changed, and not the black man, despite my growing interest in his problems. I had developed an antagonism for which I could find no rational basis whatsoever. It was I who had changed. Braum surely understood where his troubling sensation had come from, the entire worldview for which he'd been trained to the point where it was now a visceral reality for him. Yet as Braum recalled in the speech from the dock, this was the moment that led to an entire shift in his life, the progression that ultimately led him to the Communist Party, which he said had always stood firm on the belief of the brotherhood of men. But as much as that might have been the destination, something Braum could not have known at the time, there is something else here which I regard as characteristic and which underlay the ideological shift. In Braum's initial reflection, He did not dwell on social structures or political ideology or abstract solutions. Instead, in a moment of intense honesty, he concentrated on himself and the change that he would have to undergo, both as preface to the political transformation he would work for and that would come about through the very process of that work. The two aspects could only develop together, but the first step was that honest look inward as a measure of accountability. It's a small moment, just a handshake in the great drama of South African history or in the life of one individual. Why subject it to such a close reading? Precisely because of its resonance, I would suggest. Who among us would think that the politics of race and racism are things of the past? At different levels and in different ways, we now face a whole matrix of differences in the world, whether of race, class, religion, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. All of us have been bred into habits of hierarchy and identity, of oppression and subjection, which color our views of ourselves, our views of others, our instinctive responses and reactions, the preperceptions which guide us, even subconsciously. Most of us would probably agree that those hierarchies and supremacies need to change, that those perspectives need to transform. Yet how many of us would begin by changing ourselves through the deep act of introspection that Bram Fischer took on? How many would be able to take it as far as it needs to go? For such changes cannot be made only in theory. They must be enacted in the self, which also means enacting them in the world. How hard that is to do, really to do, and not just to say. Yet there was another dimension worth remembering here, because it was precisely that instant recoil and difference that set Braum off on his life's path. The moment of division was also one of challenge, a moment of opportunity. Two hands, that is all. Yet how much underlies the touch of equality, reciprocity, and connection among human beings in the world? Braum had committed himself to the complex spaces of encounter. He had gone from closure to openness without surrendering who he was, but rather discovering his identity in its unfolding, its inaction, its extension. Braum's is not just a story of political engagement. It is also a story of what undergirds that story, the very sense of self that must change, and which changes only in relation to others. Across our borders, boundaries, inequities, hatreds, and divisions, that is still our challenge today. My second image, a pool of water. I've said that this image will come up in two guises. The first is as a swimming pool, specifically the swimming pool at 12 Beaumont Street, Oaklands, Johannesburg, where Braum and Molly and their children lived, and which they made in so many ways into an oasis. Braum's parents had constructed a swimming pool at their house in Bloemfontein, Harmony. The name says everything behind their intentions. Braum and Molly began their pool in 1954, and among the reasons was that their son Paul would be able to swim. Given his cystic fibrosis, the exercise would be good for his lungs. Braum was an inveterate swimmer, diving into the pool in both summer and winter, and as a young man, he'd like nothing better than a pre-breakfast swim in the ocean. Soon, however, the pool became a gathering point for all their friends and associates, both white and black, and on weekends and holidays, it was packed. It got to the point that when Molly was returning from Europe, Braum told her that she might like to lie at the edge of a pool on her first weekend back, but preferably not ours if you want some quiet. Some divisions were more traditional. At the pool, beer, tea, cake were provided in profusion, and the host running it all was usually Molly, while Braum was the figure around whom everyone gathered. It was a pool that took on symbolic dimensions, and that is how Nadine Gordimer presented it in her oblique tribute to the Fishers in her novel Burger's Daughter. Here the races could mix. Where there were no swimming pools in the black townships or in colored households, this was a place where all could immerse themselves in the same water. This was the way I put it in my biography. Its liquid absolutions combined the amniotic with the amnesiac. It was a place of rebirth, of regeneration, in an environment that otherwise offered every kind of stress on a daily basis. Later, it was a sign of how things had changed when, just 2 days before the Rivonia trial began, Dennis Goldberg's wife, Esme, was arrested at the swimming pool, something Molly described to her daughter, Ilse. But before that, in the strangely glorious, paradoxically glorious decade of the 1950s, it represented something else, something about the future, something about its promise, something about how the different peoples of South Africa could all live in the same space. Braum and Molly's pool opened up a different kind of harmony. I'm sure there was a price for both of them, and there may be various ways to critique the romance of the pool. And yet, underlying the romance, there was the commitment, and it had its own implications. Beyond Braum and Molly's immediate family, they became a larger family, this group of people, with ties that were personal as well as political. As it happens, the underground name for the Communist Party was the Family, perhaps not very original, and open to any kind of minimally alert police decryption, yet there was an inherent truth about it. This movement was a family, and in some ways that pool of water represented it. As I see it, this version and definition of the family as family had a good deal to do with the transition out of apartheid more than 3 decades later, not only because of the vision of what South Africa could be, but because that vision was inseparable from the core group that fashioned it. These people were a nucleus, if you like. For me, the most poignant moment in all of the interviews I undertook for the biography came when I was speaking to Walter Sisulu. I don't believe he was a swimmer, but that in a way makes the point. Sisulu spoke to me about staying overnight at the Fischers after meetings, how he would hear Paul Fischer coughing in the night and Braum running in to see him, something that touched Sisulu deeply. Braum's children were like my children, said Sisulu. When he heard that Paul Fischer had died, he said, it was like my own child had died. The swimming pool, the family, the South African future, this was the utopian promise. But what happens when that promise disappears, or even worse, when it turns into its negation? I've said that the pool appears in this story in 2 guises, and now I have my heart in my mouth as I repeat it. For there is another pool, and it is the one that Molly Fischer drowned in on the way to Cape Town to visit Ilse on her 21st birthday, when Braun would also be seeing the prisoners on Robben Island after their life sentences in the Rivonia trial. It is a terrible story. In the middle of winter, Braum driving, Molly asleep in the back, their young friend Elizabeth Lewin on the passenger seat in front, the cow crossing the road, the motorbike that came towards them, the cow stepping back, and Braum swerving to avoid it. The deep pool of water at the side of the road, so improbable in the dryness of the South African winter. The car sinking, Braum diving desperately, and finally, the solitude. The lives of his comrades had been saved. The life of his closest companion was lost. It was after this that the police began chasing Braum in earnest. After this that he was arrested, released, and arrested again. It was now that Ruth and Ilse had to deal with a sick brother, a mother gone, and a father in profound grief, though he would do his best never to show it. After the funeral, when Braum got to Robben Island to see the prisoners, Walter Sisulu asked him how Molly was. Molly is all right. Molly is all right, said Braum. He did not want to distress them. He couldn't bear to tell them. How does one continue when the very worst has happened, when the image of your happiness is lost? I most absolutely do not want to speak of equations or by way of equation. I'm wary of the temptations of allegory, which can so easily abuse the experience that people have lived through. So I will offer minimal comment and say merely that I marvel at Bram Fischer's profound depths of resilience and survival. I fear that we, or our children, or our children's children, may also have to learn those skills, if in very different ways. For here's another image of the pool, the biggest pool there is, the oceans that envelop us and tell us that we live on one planet. What are we to make of this place, this common pool that surrounds us? Will it be the utopia promised by its richness, abundance, and welcome? Or will it turn into a place of nightmare and loss? What are we prepared to risk? What are we prepared to give up? What commitments are we prepared to make? It seems those choices are up to us. Third image, the doorway. I think you can see what I'm doing here. I've gone from a very private moment of introspection to a wider social environment, to a sense of global connections. What links all of them is the underlying theme of personal involvement and commitment, a willingness, in fact, to make those linkages in the image and dedication of a life. What makes those linkages explicit in Bram Fischer's life is a doorway he encountered in Oxford. Or at least, I imagine him encountering it. When Braun first arrived here in January 1932, he described the experience in a letter to Molly. When I drove up to New College between high walls black with age, I felt just as if I was going to prison. He told Molly how he had immediately gone off to London and Edinburgh, and on his return to Oxford stuck together with a South African friend to prevent the feeling known in the Fischer family as my hartjie word koud. My heart, but the word is in the diminutive, my little heart is getting cold, becomes cold. It was a phrase that captured a chill in all the emotions, a small dread at the core of one's being. Before leaving South Africa, Braum had in fact been reluctant to go, to leave Molly, to leave his family, to leave his place in the world. But he came, he left to go to London and Edinburgh and returned. And I picture him then in front of the doorway to New College, drawing in breath, taking the plunge, much as he would into the sea or into a swimming pool. In the wider and more figurative sense, I see Oxford in general as a doorway for Braum, through which he entered a world beyond South Africa, yet strangely connected with it. It's encouraging to know that Braum didn't always see Oxford's high walls as a prison, and even in that same letter, writing of his return from Edinburgh, he described the city and the sunshine as, quote, inconceivably pretty. So it's good to know prison and pretty went together. Certainly the world to which Oxford introduced Braum was by no means so pretty. This was the time of the Great Depression, when unemployment ran to 3 million, and hunger marches from Jarrow passed through Oxford on their way to London, where they battled the police in Hyde Park. Inspired by developments on the continent, Oswald Mosley had founded the British Union of Fascists. As for Braum, he experienced those developments at first hand. In the summer of 1932, he traveled to Europe as a NUSAS delegate to student conferences, and then in the summer of 1933, he went again with his sister Ada. There, he met fascists and Nazis and Jewish refugees and witnessed the ominous effects of Hitler's rise to power. Even earlier, in June 1932, Braum took off with some friends to the Soviet Union. Very adventurous, I think, at that time especially. Under the heavy hand of his in-tourist hosts, he saw massive collective farms and vast movements of weary and haggard Russian peasants. He knew of political repression, yet saw evidence of cultural life and energy. In the destructive element, immerse, wrote Joseph Conrad, and during those years, Braum was thoroughly immersed, though he tried with all his might to find the constructive element in the threatening and in some ways exhilarating climates he found. It was a dizzying time for him, one in which he tried his level best to understand the world around him. He was at the Oxford Union when it passed its famous resolution that, quote, this house will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. He joined the Labour Club, where he heard talks on socialist planning. Conversely, he was elected a member and later became president of the Raleigh Club, whose outlook was unabashedly elitist and imperial, a further entry on Braum's list of anomalies. In the Austrian Alps and Vienna, he met people who just 1 or 2 years later would come under direct threat. In the Soviet Union, he tried desperately hard to make sense of what he was seeing, proceeding by misunderstanding as much as by comprehension. This included what we can only describe as a racist conception of Russian peasants, whom Braum saw as analogous to black South Africans, except that wasn't the term that he used in a letter to his father. Not at all comprehending how those same peasants were suffering under Stalin's collectivization policies. Yet, as I put it in the biography, if the analogy allowed him to see not Russian peasants as South African blacks, but black South Africans as Russian peasants, then the example of change in the Soviet Union might provide some oblique insights after all. Above all else, what Braum witnessed on the continent turned him implacably against the nationalism from which he had emerged. Like many others of the era, he would have seen the decisive and possibly final global conflict as lying between socialism and fascism. There's nothing like travel for making you see your home in a different light. The portal to the world was also a portal to thinking differently about it. Oxford, because of what it allowed Braum to see, helped set him on his path. Some of us might have a different view regarding some of the choices he made. Many of his contemporaries, in the light of show trials, forced collectivization, and later Hungary, did. And yet Braum was driven by a very specific sense of obligation, as well as a profound sense of loyalty. If he came from that eminent family, if he came from his political family, if he was to play a role in South Africa, he had to see it against the backdrop of everything he was seeing and discovering. He had to find a way of linking them together. We need to do him and his beliefs justice. For him, a few years later, it was communism that allowed him to see the world rationally and whole. Yet, above and beyond the question of ideology, and in some ways underlying it, this is what I want to retrieve. Through the doorway that Oxford provided, Braum made the linkage between the local and the global, and he made it through his own commitment. He saw the hinge, if you like, on and through that door. It is a linkage and a commitment, a hinge we desperately need to find today. Well, if Bram Fischer were to come back today, like the play Was Albert, South African play from the 1980s, which envisions the return of Albert Luthuli, the great ANC leader. If there were a play called Was Braum and Braum was suddenly back here, what would he see and what would he say? No doubt he would have many reasons to say, my hartjie word koud, my heart is cold. He would feel the chill, the dread that many feel currently. But it would not be for the first time in his life. In some dark irony, he would have valuable experience to draw on. The list of reasons for the chill is not hard to generate. It's true that South Africa has seen many successes, among them a string of free and fair elections and a magnificent constitution. And in both respects, the record, at least the recent record, has been better in South Africa than it has been, I would say, in the USA, where I currently live. Nonetheless, other features have been alarming. In 2012, there was the Marikana Massacre, so reminiscent of Sharpeville before it. Could this really occur in the new country Braum had given his life for? By 2019, the unemployment rate in South Africa had risen, depending on how one counts, to somewhere between 29% and 38%, much of it disproportionately felt by youth, much of it by women. South Africa has extraordinarily high rates of sexual violence. In the year since April 2018, over 41,000 people were raped. The xenophobia directed at non-South African Africans that flared in 2008 and 2015 revived just a month or two ago in Johannesburg with grievous effect. Under the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, South Africa became a byword for AIDS denialism. Under the presidency of Jacob Zuma, it became a byword, sad to say, for corruption. The masses to whom the ANC had been committed were in various ways living in a state of abandonment. There was the phenomenon outlined by Public Protector Thuli Madonsela of state capture under the malign influence of the Gupta brothers. As it happens, the phrase state capture is one that I believe fits the USA under Donald Trump quite well, or Hungary under Viktor Orban, or Russia under Vladimir Putin, which brings us to the global context, the context that Bram Fischer might confront if he came back today. China has become a parody communist/capitalist country, combining the worst historical aspects of both. After the fall of communism, Russia is experiencing a kind of zombie afterlife, state authoritarianism, gangster capitalism, profound cynicism. If Braum had confronted that in what for him was the home of world communism, I think he would have found it heartbreaking. Everywhere there is the attack on reason and meaning, and most of all, there are two phenomena that may well be linked. The one is the refugee crisis, evident on virtually every continent in the world. The other is the reality of global warming and what it means for the planet we live on. Every day brings news of that. Yet there is a paradox here, which we can crystallize quite succinctly. If Braum had been alive in 1989, he would have seen virtually simultaneously the fall of apartheid and the fall of communism. The one would have gladdened him beyond measure, the other saddened him equally. Within a few short years, however, even his gladness in South Africa would have turned to sadness and quite possibly a feeling of betrayal of all that his generation of anti-apartheid fighters had stood for. But, and this is the paradox, now some 30 years later, perhaps his belief in communism might have revived after all. Who can doubt that our precipitate charge down the slopes of climate disaster has been exacerbated, if not caused, by the unrestrained drive to growth of a rampant and unchecked capitalist hegemony in the world? Who can doubt the links between inequity across the globe and the tragedy of refugee flight, whether because of war or economic privation? No doubt Braum would have had to modify his ideology and expand it in certain ways. After all, in a mirror image to capitalism, communism shared the commitment to growth and the exploitation of natural resources. But the conviction that all are deserving of respect and dignity, that all deserve a share in the benefits of the world we inhabit, that the very future of the world is at stake, this was intrinsic to Bram Fischer's nature. These are issues he would have found a way of fighting for. And perhaps his heart would have been gladdened as well, not least in the revolt of youth around these matters. In someone like Greta Thunberg, he might have seen a young prophet for our times. I want to draw towards a conclusion by mentioning a number of themes in Bram Fischer's life that could not be more important as we contemplate our world. What I'm reaching towards, as I have been doing all the way through this talk, are the codes underlying his codes. One of them has to do with identity. If we look back on that swimming pool at the Fischer home in Beaumont Street, perhaps nowadays, as I've suggested, its romanticism and idealism would be apparent. I can even imagine the argument that in its patronage it was a site of the privilege it tried to undo. At the least, we can say that it may not be possible for everyone to swim in the same pool so easily. Around the world, we have seen, on the one hand, the resurgence of nationalism, tribalism, nativism. On the other, we have seen the rise of various kinds of identitarian politics in which people are divided according to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, where class is almost now an afterthought. South Africa is experiencing what appears to be a revival of racial identification and even animosity. The idea of intersectionality, of interacting and overlapping oppressions and resistance, negotiates some of this, but it can also reinforce the divisions it attempts to overcome. In this context, we need to relearn the ethics of reciprocity and encounter in the uneven boundaries that lie between us. And I would stress that these boundaries are uneven as we confront one another across the gaps of authority and power. Yet those boundaries can also be filled with creativity and meaning, for meaning, after all, occurs not despite difference, but because of it. Difference is the great provocation towards meaning, and especially towards new meanings in the world. When I interviewed Nelson Mandela about Braum, he told me how, at the beginning of his own political career, he wanted nothing to do with members of other races. He certainly wanted nothing to do with communists. Yet it was by working together with those in the liberation movement and seeing how people such as Bram Fischer or Joe Slovo or Yusuf Dadoo or many, many others had the same commitment as he did that he came to see things differently. Braum himself expanded his sense of identity in the South African struggle in an emblematic way. In committing himself to all of South Africa's people, he did not surrender his identity as an Afrikaner. Rather, he did what he did because he was an Afrikaner, seeing the fuller meaning of the word as African. And if I can be permitted just a slight disagreement with Nelson Mandela on this point, it feels to me Braum was not fighting against his own people. In his way, he was fighting for his people. It's just that they didn't understand the shift that he had made. It was through contact and commitment in those difficult spaces of interaction that he made this shift. These are gifts and commitments, the ability to risk those encounters that we need to rediscover now. Connected with this is a constellation of other themes involving belonging, home, dwelling, and hospitality. I'll try to explain the links between them, starting with the idea of belonging. Bram Fischer was committed to belonging, most specifically to belonging in South Africa. For him, it was an affiliation bred in the body as much as in the mind, drawn from the landscape as much as the people, the whole matrix of sensations that had enveloped him since he first grew up on the family farm. But his affiliation was also moral and political. When Braun was granted bail from his trial in South Africa to argue the Privy Council case in London, some of his comrades tried to persuade him to stay there, but Braun had no second thoughts. He returned home to stand trial, and even when he went underground, not for a minute did he think of leaving South Africa. Right to the last, when his close associates were being arrested and tortured, and his own recapture was imminent, he made no attempt to flee. South Africa was where he belonged, it was his home, and that was where he would stay. But what was the content of that belonging, and what did home mean to him? It was certainly not belonging for himself alone, not just a matter of his own home. His orientation in going underground said it all. It was vital for someone such as himself to stay and to carry on the struggle inside South Africa. Home for him only had meaning if it meant a meaningful and just home for all. That, of course, is the wider meaning of home, the homeland or country or dwelling place. Braum's insistence meant that all had to be welcome in that home. It had to be a dwelling space for everyone, a place of hospitality in the most profound sense. Beyond the matter of swimming pools, let us think back to that Fischer home in Beaumont Street, what it was and what it symbolized. It was a home open and hospitable to all. The French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas puts it this way, quote, "The possibility for the home to open to the other is as essential to the essence of the home as closed doors and windows." Jacques Derrida glosses the meaning of this idea. The dwelling opens to itself as, quote, "a land of asylum or refuge." A land of asylum or refuge. This was what Bram Fischer embodied for us. He understood, as well as anyone ever has, that freedom and dignity for the self depends on freedom and dignity for all. For Braum to belong was for others to belong. For him to have a home was for others to have a home. For him to have a country was for others to have the same. These things were inseparable, and what linked them in his life was the simple and profound fact of his integrity, my last theme for today. Integrity means integration, bringing together. It means no gap between thought and deed, no break between principle and action. At some level, it means the opposite of segregation, of compartmentalization, of excuses, of tiredness, of disintegration, of despair. For Braum, integrity meant bringing people together so that they might live in peace. During his time in Oxford, Braum wrote to Molly, promising her he would be, quote, "as honest as it's possible for a human being to be." There can be no doubt that whatever his anomalies, that was a promise he did his utmost to keep. There are many moments in his speech from the dock in 1965 one might quote, but let me choose just one, when Braum explained the reasons for his actions. He said, and I quote, "I felt responsible, not to those who are indifferent to the sufferings of others, but to those who are concerned." Home, dwelling, hospitality, the suffering of others, integrity, commitment. It is in these respects that the life of Bram Fischer becomes a template. At some level, it is quite simple, at others, so profoundly difficult. For the self to belong, others must belong as well. How hard it is to live up to that. As we face our world, with its inequities, with its refugees, with our planet changing before our eyes, the question is whether we can dwell here in a different way, make our world into a different kind of dwelling space for all human beings, and yes, non-human beings as well. The bar is high, the task immensely difficult, but let us take some courage as well. I'd like to end in this respect with a moment that links South Africa and Oxford. When Bram Fischer was ill and dying in his brother Paul's house in Bloemfontein, he received a letter from his former moral tutor at Oxford, Christopher Cox. I'm not sure if they still have moral tutors, the person who's meant to take care of your well-being. So this was a letter written by Bram's moral tutor at Oxford, Christopher Cox. Braum may have passed beyond the realms of consciousness by the time it arrived, but this is what the letter said. We were lucky enough to have many splendid people in New College in those active tutorial years of mine in the late 20s and 30s, but none whom I think of, if I may say so, with more respect and more regard than yourself. More respect and more regard, more thought, more contemplation, more commitment. It is not just what we learn from Bram Fischer. This is surely what we owe Bram Fischer in our times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Clingman, for really bringing Bram Fischer alive in such a deep and multi-layered way, and having him speak to the present and the future. Thank you so much. We are going to take some, I should give you this one. We have some time for some questions, Q&A. And so I'm going to recognize people and ask Professor Clingman to respond. So the floor is open for questions and comments. And I believe we may also have the ability to have a few from South Africa. Is that right? I'm looking at the wonderful Julie Knight.
It should be on your sheet, Elizabeth.
It's on my sheet.
I think there's a question on the order of proceedings.
Ah, excuse me. Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, is there a question from Rhodes House first? Yes, please. Please wait for the microphone, and if you could just introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Dhruva, and I'm a Rhodes Scholar from India. And my question is this theme that we've been going back to, which is either Bram Fischer as someone who went against his own people or who redefined what his people wanted, depending on how you interpret it. Which groups or communities of people that we belong to as Rhodes Scholars or people in this audience do you think it's most important for us to be traitors to in today's time, or to redefine the desires and interests of?
Well, thanks very much. That's a very serious question. I'm kind of pleased I'm not a Rhodes Scholar to have to answer it. You know, what's on my mind at the moment is, in fact, refugee crises around the world, and I think on virtually every continent that's true. And I think that it really goes to the heart of who we are as human beings and who we are as societies. It's certainly, you know, I live in the US. There are refugees on the southern border, children being ripped away from their parents and put in cages. The Rohingya refugees, you know, one thinks of. Just in so many different places around the world. And it's not as if any single individual is going to solve these problems, you know, in her or his own way or in their own terms. But to develop a different kind of philosophy of what it means to be a dweller on this planet really just feels extremely important to me right now. And I know, I see it in my students at the University of Massachusetts where I teach. These questions are very much alive for them. They are confronting a future which may look very different from the world that their parents inhabited or their grandparents inhabited, with a whole, any number of different questions. I'm going to revise what I just said. There are so many issues. You can take your pick, I really think you can take your pick. And what impresses me is the fact that someone like you and people like you are actually asking those questions. And I think that I'm drawing a lot of encouragement from younger people who seem to have that sense of an agenda on their minds. I don't really claim to have any of the answers or anything like that, but I just think building those movements, building a consensus, building a sense of accountability, nothing could be more important at this point.
Thank you. So let's take one more in the back there.
Good evening. My name is Adam. I'm from Ethiopia. So my question is around the current context of South Africa, actually. So when I think of Bram Fischer or Nelson Mandela or Kwame Nkrumah or many of those, I rather see their work magnificent, but in a more simple form of liberation, which is quite clear in human rights approach. But in terms of the current context of countries like South Africa or others, how do you see an Afrikaner or a white South African? What does it mean to be a Bram Fischer in the context of South Africa now?
Yeah, thanks for that as well. And again, I'm not actually living in South Africa right now, so I want to acknowledge that whatever I say is said from a distance. It feels to me, I use the word a template, Bram Fischer, as a template. And there was that moment of introspection that I dwelt on. And it feels to me, not only in South Africa, I think it's true in the United States, it's probably true in Britain as well. That kind of introspection is way overdue. I think people need to look in the mirror and see who they are and what they believe in a very profound way. And I would say, and I think there are some, Afrikaners in South Africa for whom Bram Fischer really is a model, and for, whom he represents a possibility, a way forward, a different way of being. And I would like to believe that that's an example that many could follow if they were willing to do so. There are debates around the world, around race, around whiteness, what that means, and the privileges that come with it. And I'm sure it's a live question in South Africa as well. And it feels to me that that's something that Bram Fischer came to terms with and actually examined in his own life, and didn't see it as a paralyzing question, but saw it as a prompt to get involved, to work, to make something happen. So in all these different ways, if I understood your question correctly, it feels to me that Bram Fischer's spirit is still alive, should still be alive, as an example that others can follow.
We have a question from a member of the South African audience who is with us through live stream. Chris Peters, who is a legal researcher at the Helen Suzman Foundation. It seems appropriate as a next question after Adam's. He wrote, Bram Fischer is one of many who found the courage to speak out against views held by their people, parties, and countries. It seems that many views need speaking out against in these times. How do we empower people to find that courage, like Braum, to speak out and be heard? And maybe how was Braum empowered as well? So.
Well, actually, thanks for adding that on, because it's worth saying that Braum was empowered by his family heritage, a lot of it. He had a very, very eminent family. They had been leaders in their community, leaders in the Orange Free State. His grandfather was a member of a cabinet, the first union cabinet. His father was judge president of the Orange Free State. And so there was a sense of, I won't say entitlement, because that wasn't true for Braum, but a sense of a role to play, a role that he had in his life. And so I don't think he ever felt any reticence about that. I mean, not everybody who was born into those circumstances became a Bram Fischer. That's also worth remembering. So he did take that on. I think it's quite different for somebody who isn't born into that situation of relative I'm going to say relative privilege, because let's not forget that the Fischers had fought against British imperialism, had suffered because of it, that the family suffered in the 1914 rebellion when Braum's father sided with the rebels against the entry of South Africa into the First World War. But nonetheless, it was a position of relative privilege and placement. He came to Rhodes House. You know, these were things that gave you a sense of a role in the world. How do you make that for other people? More difficult, I think much more difficult. People have to learn to have a voice, to use those voices, to speak, to engage with others, to organize with others. And what are the motives for doing that? That feels to me also important in this. What are the motives? It would be nice to believe that people have an instinctive capacity for compassion. I think we do actually have that instinct, but often it gets suppressed. You know, there are too many problems out there in the world. There's nothing we can do about it. Too big for us. And sometimes there's a kind of failure of altruism. People care for those close to them, but when people are further away, they're not going to care quite so much. What makes the difference to me now is the sense, and this really connects with what I was talking about today, that if nothing else generates people to get involved, there should be a level of self-interest, because this is the world that we are going to inhabit. This is the one that we're going to have to live in. And it needs to be a better place than it is currently. And we need to make a space for other people. It goes back to what you were talking about with the concept of Ubuntu. A person is a person because of other people. If others are oppressed, well, you get unrest. That's what happens. You know, it's just, there's a kind of logic to it. If you want to create more peaceful conditions for people, you have to equalize things. The powerful have to give up power. That's a very, very hard thing to do. But whether people are empowered or powerless, it feels at some level we've all got the same interests at heart, which is changing the system that exists to one in which everyone has a place. So it feels to me, how do you encourage people to do that? Well, you know, I think events like this, it happens in classrooms, it ought to happen in the press, it ought to happen in communities and in all kinds of ways. And I actually do think quite a bit of that is happening. So that is the encouraging part.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question up here.
Hello, my name is Nicolas Champeau. I'm a French filmmaker. Did your research and your interviews enable you to reconcile the fact that Bram Fischer during the day would defend the interests of gold mines and pharmaceutical companies, whereas during the night he was, you know, the clandestine head of the Communist Party? Was this an intentional cover-up? Was this because he was also whether he enjoyed the technical and the legal issues that involved that his law practice? How do you explain? Did he make peace with this? Why did he carry on for so long? Thank you.
Yes, well, you know, there was that anomaly that Braun was on a retainer from the gold mines, from the capitalist gold mines, while he was a member of the Communist Party. How do you explain that? I'm not sure what Lenin or Trotsky would have thought of that. You know, there's no way of telling. But I think some of it can be explained just through chronology and the way things developed. When Braum came back to Johannesburg in the 1930s, the depression, the effects of the depression were still on, and he was starting out as a lawyer in very difficult circumstances, and he had to take what came in. And at that point, he was not a member of the Communist Party, at least in terms of what I've been able to tell. He was not yet a member of the Communist Party, and he began to develop a kind of line in gold law. It began to be something he was good at, and he was mentored by people who were good at it as well. And the jobs came in, the work came in, and so that became a kind of specialty of his. And so he continued to do it. It's hard for me to get into his mind. I don't think it was just used as a kind of political cover, because everybody knew Bram Fischer. Everybody knew at a certain point that this guy who's representing the mining houses is also a member of the Communist Party. He didn't conceal that because the Communist Party was legal. He had no reason to conceal it. Later, he would have had reason to conceal it. I think he was someone who in his own life felt that he could connect disparate parts of the universe together and make them sort of work. I imagine him having a conversation with himself in which the thinking would have gone, yes, I'm representing them, but I want them to be a different kind of operation at some point in the future. You know, I could imagine that. He continued to do it, but it didn't stop him doing the other things as well. And after a while, he was out of gold mining law, I think, at a certain point. And then he was involved in, the great political trials. And again, he was very much on view, very much in the public eye, and at a lot of risk to himself, I think, and didn't try and conceal any of that. At that point, when he was in the public eye, especially, say, during the Rivonia trial, he was himself banned. That was a different kind of anomaly. Someone who is banned and at risk from the police, stepping into the spotlight to take on that legal defense of Mandela and the other accused. And so he was used to those kinds of disparities, if you like. And in a way, that one actually worked for him because in some way it was the safest place for him to be, in the spotlight, because the rest of the world was watching and they couldn't just take out, the leader of the defense for the Rivonia trialists. But I don't have a perfect answer for your question. It's a reasonable one, but it's one of those things. It's one of those details that makes, if you don't mind me putting it this way, it's what makes a biography a biography. It's not a matter of political science. It's somebody's life. And lives are full of complexity. Thank goodness for that.
Yes, we have a question up here in the front, and then one further back. Right here, front row. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, thank you. That was fascinating and wonderful. A question. You referred earlier to the big question that we all ask ourselves: where do these people, where does someone like Bram Fischer find the courage, find the empowerment? And I'd simply like to ask you, to what extent did he find those qualities? Was he given those qualities by his wonderful wife, Molly?
Yes, it's important to bring Molly back into the picture. I think Molly and Braum were real partners in this. Molly had a kind of something of the instinctive rebel in her. She was a hugely lively, energized, engaging individual. People of all descriptions sort of were just mesmerized by her, I think, as Braum was. And I think that Molly had a sense that the world could be different. I mean, I don't think she preceded him into the Communist Party or anything like that, but she was an absolutely equal partner in doing it. And I am convinced that he would have drawn some of his courage from her as she did from him. And, all the more tragic, poignant, just awful, when she died. At that point, he had to find other kinds of courage, I think. I do think some of his courage came from his family situation. When Braum was arrested the first time, I think it was his mother who said, we've been through this before. We know what it's like. They had fought British imperialism. They had suffered for some of it. Percy had his father Percy had gone through, paying a price for his own affiliations. But yes, absolutely bring Molly back into the picture. And it's actually kind of interesting that in the emergency of 1960, it was Molly who was detained, first of all. Braum expected it to be him. She expected it to be him. But when the knock on the door came, they came for Molly. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Jason. I'm a human rights lawyer from Zimbabwe and South Africa, and now a graduate student here. And my question is really whether, it's been 2 decades since you wrote the book, or since you finished it. And the question is whether if you were to be finishing it now, you would do anything differently or see anything differently. And I'm thinking specifically of two of your remarks today. The one about the possible relevance of communism in the face of growing global inequality, and some of your comments about the ANC leadership after the period when you wrote the book, after some of the sheen had rubbed off the liberation movement that Braum had known.
Actually, it's a perfect book. I wouldn't change a thing. Just, that's an interesting thing about biography, or any book, in fact. Biography is not the life. The life is the life. The biography is the writing of a life. It's a different kind of thing. And so it's inevitably going to be written from a certain time and place with certain perspectives that emerge. And intriguing now to think of the book, 20 years later, 21 years later. I do have a section at the end of the book where I reflect on Braum's life and some of the larger issues. And I imagine that some of these questions would have come in at that point. Although there's also, I can also imagine some people thinking, leave that out of the book, just, talk about the life and end it there and let it speak for itself. But it feels to me, yes, biography is a kind of dialogue, if you like, between the subject that you're writing about and the self who's writing it. And I did what I could to try and be accountable to the life of the person I was writing about, not to impose, not to read into. If you don't mind me saying, there were a number of times during the writing of the book when I wished I was writing a novel, because I could have changed the facts, I could have made it better. I could have made it more resonant, or the patterns could have been different in some way. But then you go back, you read the letter, you see what he actually said, you see what he actually did, and you realize, I can't do that, So I'm digressing a bit, but even over and above that, there is a kind of dialogue between the writer and the subject matter. So I just imagine that if I were doing it now, that some of these perspectives would come into play. And strangely, in a way, they wouldn't only work against communism or against, Braum's ideology, as I've suggested. I think that the world that we inhabit has made us think quite hard about what growth actually means, what development actually means, what it's all for, And at some level, I think Braum understood what it was all for. It was for a better place for everybody. And that's, as I say, I'm so aware of the gap between saying these things and making it happen. But here's someone who took that plunge, who tried to make it happen, That's why his portrait is up there. That's why we do this today.
Thank you so much. That was, I think that's a perfect moment to finish this part of the evening and to move to the unveiling of the memorial plaque. But before we do that, could I just please ask you to join me in thanking Professor Clingman? And now I'd like to ask Sean Johnson, who as I introduced earlier, the founding director of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, also a writer, a novelist. I loved your point about wishing you could write a novel. Maybe you still can write a novel. And I'd like to ask Sean to come forward and to lead us through the unveiling.
Thank you, Elizabeth, very much. Stephen, you've finished your thesis. I finished my novel, so we're even. Thank you very, very much. I found that very moving, and I learned I thought I knew everything about Bram Fischer, but I learned some new things. So thank you very, very much. I enjoyed that. The unveiling didn't come with an invitation to make a speech, so I shan't. Jeff? Okay. But I would just like to say this. I was working it out. I'm not particularly numerate, but I was working out that I first came into this hall 37 years ago. And, I was just a little young, ignorant South African Rhodes Scholar who couldn't believe what had happened to him. And I was really, really proud to be here, but I was also very conflicted. Stephen, this is for you. Who among white South African males could we admire? It was a terrible thing. A terrible thing. Well, Bram Fischer was one of them. You know, when I was, Elizabeth, at Oxford all those years ago, and I'm looking to see what the age groups are, there was a television program called Spitting Image. I don't know if any of you remember it. But it was utterly appalling for me because their major hit was a song called I've Never Met a Nice South African. This was terrible. And so what my approach to that, because one has to be strategic, it was to pretend that I was from New Zealand. But let me just say this. I'm so thrilled that Bram Fischer finds a resting place. It means a lot to people like me. And if I may share, Elizabeth, a little bit of information, because I did my homework. The very first Bram Fischer lecture in this room was given by one of my other heroes, Beyers Naudé, on the 18th of January, 1989. And Beyers gave it here. We laughed so much because he and I, of course, was a young baby boy, and he was a great person. But he and I had actually been recorded by the South African security police, who were so new to the technology of spying that they played the thing back to us by mistake. Beyers Naudé and I had that wonderful, wonderful memory from that time. So, I am very glad to be here. Thank you, after all these years. And I am very delighted, if I may, to do the unveiling. Okay. Bram Fischer, Orange Free State and New College, 1931, 23rd of April 1908 to the 8th of May 1975. Afrikaner freedom fighter, his courage made the future possible. That's beautiful.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you all for being here. And many, many thanks to the Fischer family and friends who asked for this memorial plaque. And we're really honored, deeply, deeply honored for it to hang in Rhodes House. We have a reception, which is, I believe, through those doors. So you're all welcome to join us and to continue the conversation. I hope that we will all take to heart the words of Professor Clingman for us to take that spirit of Bram Fischer, to take that spirit of introspection, of courage, and of imagining and actually acting on creating a better world. So with that, thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.